welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate the support on all our platforms. This is a part two and the final part of our opening week coverage of the 2023-2024 NBA season. And I think this season feels extremely different in a good way. We've got some games, storylines to talk about. And before we kick this episode off, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Opening week of the NBA still pretty much continues. So we'll kind of kick it off, with a team that we didn't really get to the last time that
Yeah.
we recorded, and that was Warriors Kings. And so, specifically the Kings. So the Kings in their first season opener, right? They beat the Jazz. Um, and then in their second game against the Warriors, right, they ended up losing 114 to 122. In a game that I think kind of just sort of illustrates just the pecking order, I think, in the Western Conference, kind of where,
Sure.
you know, a team like the Kings, you know, last year, right, they were really good, which I still think they'll be a good team. And then come playoff time, they're just probably just not going to have enough to go against the top team. So we'll start with the Warriors, right? Obviously, huge game from Steph, 41 points, 4 assists, 2 steals, 7 of 10 from three. Kind of like the playoffs, it felt like all over
Mm-hmm.
again, where just the Kings didn't really have any real defensive answer for Steph, and I think that makes a lot of sense, just in regards to when you look at the Kings personnel. I think some of the schemes that the Kings run defensively aren't necessarily bad. I think they make sense. They just don't have the people for it. Um, and I think that just kind of illustrates the ceiling of like Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox led team. When you look at Fox, right, he had a really good game as well in terms of 39 points, 4 assists, 2 steals, and that makes sense because the Warriors don't really have anybody to stick with him either. And Sabonis, I think, offensively, right, 19, 18, and 7 with 3 steals. But then I think, you just kind of look at the plus minus with a -9, with Fox being a +1. And I think that just kind of illustrates some of the weaknesses with the Kings team. Keegan Murray didn't necessarily have a great game, 6 of 16. Um, Barnes was okay, but again, I think not really having like a great rim protector. Also combined with not having like a lot of great defenders on the squad. Um, I think is kind of an issue for the team long term. And again, like it's a team where they didn't really do a whole lot in the off season.
Yeah.
They ended up adding Vale McGee. Um, who was okay, right? Just as a guy that can be a lob threat and grab some rebounds and contest shots at the rim, but he's also an older guy.
Mm-hmm.
So, how impactful is he going to be, going forward? And, like I said, I liked a couple of the things that the Kings did. The Duarte trade was interesting. I mean, he didn't play very well
Yeah.
at all. Actually, pretty bad, I think.
One for seven.
In the, yeah, 1 for 7, 0 of 4 from three, fouled out,
Yep.
played 20, yeah, played 26 minutes. You can clearly tell like they're kind of hoping and relying on him to kind of provide, I think, some help at that wing spot.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't necessarily think he's like an amazing option for that. Just because again uh, they just don't have a lot of help on the interior or on the wings. Like their wings are okay, Murray and Barnes, right? That's fine, but Barnes is a little bit older.
Mm-hmm.
And Murray is a solid defender, but he's not like a elite defender just
Right.
yet. So I think that just kind of illustrates the issues with the Kings. Um, in a matchup like this, where like the Warriors, right? Like say in Game 1, it looked kind of rough at times, but against this Kings team, right, they can pretty much get whatever type of shots they want, right? Where the 3-point shooting was much better this game, which makes sense because again the Kings are not great defensively. Not that the Suns are a great defensive team, but I think they'll probably be a better defensive team than the Kings, just because I think some of the personnel defensively is better, right? Like say, like Durant's a decent defender. When Booker's healthy, he's a decent defender. Kogie's a decent defender, and then Nurkic is a better rim protector than Sabonis.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you look at the Kings, there's just not a lot of great defense in that matchup. So I think, again with the Warriors, I think you also saw some of the strength in terms of the bench, right? Kuminga and Moody looked pretty solid, in their third year. So I think you kind of need a bounce back year from those two guys, especially in the playoffs. Because again, there were times in the regular season where they played, but if they can do this type of stuff in the playoffs, that kind of helps them a lot as well. Uh, and again, like with Chris Paul running the second unit and then also just setting guys up, like again, there's a lot to like there. Um, but like I said, I think for me, it's the biggest takeaway is the Kings. I think are still kind of a tier below some of those other top teams. So what do you think?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And oddly enough, this is one of the teams that we received some criticism on. People were saying that we were sleeping on them going into this season. And I'm gonna continue to sleep. I think this team has a very interesting ceiling. I think they can't go too far in the playoffs just because, like you said, their defense isn't there. And then my problem is their depth. I don't really like, their bench. I think it's a very weak bench. I think it has potential and like guys that can turn up, but over the course of time in the playoffs, I just don't think it's going to be sustainable. That's really my one big issue. De'Aaron Fox is clutch though. I think that's probably one of the few bright spots. Obviously, De'Aaron Fox and Sabonis, but like you said, that duo can't really get you super far. I think they're just missing, a third star or even just some more depth. I think, they can live with giving up like JaVale McGee and Duarte to get some better impact players. I don't know, but that's just me. Um, but overall, this game was interesting. I thought it was more of a thriller. I really enjoyed watching, especially like the final 2 minutes
Yeah.
from both of these teams. Curry pretty much putting the game away, and then Fox trying to get back into it. But yeah, for me, the Kings are pretty much a no go. I would probably stay away from them, picking them to go far in the playoffs or anything like that. We kind of know what their storyline's probably going to be. They're probably going to be a very good regular season team, and then come playoffs, we get to see their ceiling in a 7 game series once you figure out how to attack them, which isn't that hard because, like you said, there's not a lot of defense being played. Um, the main thing that they've got going is offense. I will give them that. Their offense is very stellar. I like it, especially when their guys are on.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that how often are those guys going to be on in a 7 game series, right? Say
Mm-hmm.
like a Kevin Herter, right? Yeah, he went scoreless and only played 16 minutes, and I think that just is because he's pretty much out there for his shooting, and if
Mm-hmm.
he's not knocking down shots, what else is he doing? And that's kind of something to think about, right? Because they traded for him, and he had a solid regular season last year, and then in the playoffs he just went cold.
Yeah,
That can happen to guys who are primarily jump shooters. Is that when the shot's not falling, it's a lot tougher. And there were times where he tried to defend in the playoffs. It's just again his defensive ceiling is kind of low. He's got some size to him, but
yeah,
still, that's just kind of something to think about. Because again, this is a Kings team where I think they could down the line make some type of move if
I
they
agree.
wanted to. The team as currently constructed, I don't think is good enough to go far. Like, because again, I just what would be the matchup in the first round that they could get that would allow them to get out of the first round? I just think it'd be really tough
Yeah,
if they were to face one of the teams that we think are the top tier Western Conference teams. I just don't really see them being able to get past any of those teams in the first round, which they'd probably have to see at least one of them, like Nuggets, Warriors, Lakers, Suns, whatever order. I just don't really see a path for them to get through any of those teams just
yeah,
because of the lack of defense. And those teams are pretty good offensive teams, I think.
yeah. I agree.
Yeah, and they can hurt them in the ways where the Kings are vulnerable because all of those teams, like have guys that can attack the rim. So,
Mm-hmm.
but just moving on, kind of going around, some other matchups. There was kind of a game where it wasn't really necessarily like the final result to me. That
Mm-hmm.
was kind of, that was the big takeaway. It was just kind of what happened leading up to it, and that was the Heat Timberwolves game. It was a game in which Jimmy Butler he sat out for rest, which I think was kind of surprising, just given the fact that the NBA it seemed like had been trying to crack down this season on guys sitting out for rest. I think the fines primarily come from if multiple stars, if I'm not mistaken, sit out,
Mm-hmm.
but they did have multiple guys that were out, but not necessarily stars, right? Like Bam played, Lowry played, Hero played, but Butler was out, and they ended up losing.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it was kind of interesting because it was actually kind of a back and forth game for the most part until the fourth quarter, despite the Heat being without their best player, and
Mm-hmm.
with Minnesota, the only guy being out basically is McDaniel's, who is important, right? But in a matchup where Butler is playing, not quite as important.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I think the main thing is, what did you think about the rest thing? Because I feel like Game
Mm.
3, to start off the season is kind of bizarre, to already have people resting, and because we're already kind of starting to see some guys miss games due to things like injury or rest or whatever.
Yeah.
So, how did you feel about it?
I mean, I understand it. I understand the thought process. They want to save these guys for the playoffs. We get that. But my main concern is like what 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 do you really gain from that? Because it's so early in the season to me. I can understand mid-season, but this early, I'm not really sure what the full thought process is unless these guys are dealing with, like self-reported stingers or stuff like that, where it's injuries that could be nagging over time and they just don't want to risk, aggravation. Like I think that's what's going on with Beal. I think he hurt his back in either practice or one of the preseason games. So they've been conserving and saving him for his debut or whatever. But like with a guy like Jimmy Butler, I'm not sure what the issue was. So, I think you're saying that it's rest. I mean, I would say rest from what? He only played 2 games. I know the Boston game was a good and pretty, lengthy duel, in which they lost, but I don't think that, you know, can translate into yeah, you get a day off. If you know what I'm trying to say. I get it, but at the same time I don't really fully support it.
Right. Yeah. Because that's the thing. Because again, if the new rules were kind of designed to curb some of that stuff, and it's still going to happen, and it'll happen from time to time, anyways. Then it's like, you know, how much did it really improve anything?
Right.
Because again, we're already having guys that are out, for one reason or another, and
Right.
it's probably going to continue just because it's a long season. So
Yeah. I don't get
yeah,
it
and
really.
then yeah, and then I guess the actual matchup that was more intriguing was the one between the Heat and the Celtics, right? Which
Mhm.
was a matchup between the two teams that went to the Eastern Conference Finals, where the Heat bested the Celtics in a 7-game series. But this time it does seem like with the Celtics, they're just the better team. I think. Where I think there's just a little bit too much talent for the Heat to be able to overcome. Although for a good chunk of the game, Miami did have control of it. But then the Celtics, kind of similar to the first game, right, were able to close it out in the fourth quarter, which, if that's a reoccurring theme where the Celtics are able to kind of get, back control of games in the fourth, that bodes well for them. Jalen Brown, I think he had a bounce back performance because in the first game, I think he really struggled.
Yeah.
I think, kind of like what we talked about um, before, right, when we kind of hinted at the first, stretch of opening night games, where for a lot of these teams, it's going to be a process to figure out, the pecking order of all these guys and,
Mhm.
where guys should be and what their roles are. And it's a
Mhm.
different role for Jalen Brown, right? Because now he's going to have to, on some nights, right, sacrifice some touches to the other guys. But he was kind of the guy, that they went through a lot late in the game, in
Right.
addition to Derek, right? Because like in the first game, it was more Tatum and Porzingis, whereas in this game, right, it was more so Brown and White that had the favorable matchup, which makes sense, right? Because the Heat's guards are not necessarily great, defensively, and Hero and Lowry. Well, Lowry, at this point is just older, so
Right.
I mean, he's no longer as good defensively as he was before.
Mhm.
But I just feel like again, it just kind of highlights the matchup where I think the Celtics will be better equipped, in the playoffs to be able to handle, late game situations, which they just seem like they weren't as good at last year. And I think that's just because they have some more, just some more talent, and a guy like a Drew Holiday, right, who, again, managed this game much better than I think he did. In the first game, because and again, like some of it just comes down to guys are going to look a lot worse if they're missing shots. Even if like what they do isn't necessarily tied as much to offense, but still,
Yeah.
in this game, much better offensively, and the Celtics as a whole, were able to close it out, and I think that bodes well for them if they can continue, to handle games better in the clutch because they weren't as good at that last year, and I think that was their downfall.
Yeah, and they had a great, this was their home opener, I believe. So this is a great showing for them.
Hmm.
Tatum 22 points, Porzingis 17, Drew Holiday
Yeah, that was
17,
impressive.
Derek White with a monster game, and he had some great defensive plays. Blocks, chase
Mhm.
down blocks. So, this team is looking like the one to beat in the East. At this point, I know Milwaukee looks good as well. But I think down the line, I think longevity wise, I think Boston will probably come away with the number one seed, but
Hmm.
the Bucks will be like that team that like we know is gonna give Boston a run for its money pretty much because I just don't see that with like Philly and some other teams in the East. But overall, very interesting to see Boston in this situation. They've definitely gotten better, and I think they arguably had the best offseason um in the NBA. So it should be interesting to watch.
Right. And then moving on, I guess we'll kind of go to, the team that you mentioned, Philadelphia, right?
Hmm.
Philadelphia, Toronto. Philly ended up pulling this one out, 114-107. Behind, a big game, from Embiid, 34, 8 and 9. But I think the real driver behind the game actually was really more so Tyrese Maxey with
Hmm.
34, 7, 6. And he's been really good through his first two games, right? Where he's basically been a 30-point scorer,
Yeah.
um, without Harden. And it seems like with Philly, the offense, we talked about it in the first one where it seemed like, you thought it didn't necessarily look as different. I think it looks more different in the sense of there's more ball movement.
Okay.
Just guys kind of just being spread around, and things are distributed a lot differently. And again, how much of that is, well, without Harden, you don't have a guy who controls the ball quite as much, not in a bad way, but just, now you have a guy in Maxey who just plays with a lot more pace, and the Sixers can play a little bit more free as well. But at the same time, again, the sustainability of it, I think, like you said before, like there's still, like, I think, below the Celtics and the Bucks. But I think the question is that if you're Philly, does this make you feel better about, hey, if we can just move Harden for something, right? Then we might have a chance, to get back up there, or does it just not necessarily matter to you?
Right. For me, it's like, I don't know. I'm taking this game with a grain of salt, to be honest, because it's against the
Sure.
freaking Toronto Raptors. I'm not, a fan of them. I don't think they're that great.
Hmm.
So it's like, yeah, I think they're playing against one of the bottom feeder teams, but I do have to give them credit. They did play a very good game, and you're right. I think in this game it looked a little bit different. In the other one, I'm not so much, unless I'm completely dumb. But I don't know. For me, I don't know. I think they do need to move on from Harden at this point. They've showcased that they can put up stats, be in games, make games close. Without him. So, I think they should move on. And at this point, I don't even think they need to get another star. I think they just need to gain some depth because I think this roster is fairly bare bones. I'm not a fan of the roster construction. Said that in the offseason, but it would be interesting if they move Harden, just get some more pieces, and then turn into a contender from there. Or, they could take the route of just getting another star and then also being a contender. Because I think, either way, they're just one Harden move away from, being back in contention and being in the top three teams in the East.
Hmm. Yeah, and then and moving on, kind of sort of like a segue between these two teams with the
Hmm.
Raptors, right?
Hmm.
The Bulls, right, kind of had an interesting, back-to-back stretch of games where they play the Raptors, um, and it was a back and forth, and then the Bulls, the first game after their team meeting, right, they actually ended up pulling it out, by a point, with DeRozan just basically like getting to the free throw line down the stretch. But then in the next game they played, then they ended up getting blown out by Detroit,
Hmm.
118-102, just kind of encapsulating the bowl season, despite Zach Levine going off for 51.
Right.
Um, and again, it's like what we talked about with the Bulls. They're not going to be good. It's a rough situation.
Hmm.
But the Pistons, have actually kind of been, so far through the first few games have looked pretty solid. I know that they had the game where even though they won against the Hornets, but it didn't necessarily look that great. But with the Pistons, we talked about it in the offseason. There's a lot of real talent on this team where,
Yeah.
if it pans out right, they could, kind of be, a competitive team, not necessarily a playoff team, right? But a team that could maybe, if things go right, maybe compete for that final play-in spot. It would be tough for sure.
Hmm.
But they have a lot of talent, I think, on this team. Again, and it starts like we talked before with Cade Cunningham, with a 25 and 10 game, and then Jalen Duren, right, who's kind of, now playing the role of the starting center, and he's been really good for them.
Yeah.
Basically averaging like 20 and 10 pretty much every game, getting blocks. Not really shooting threes like we saw in the summer league, but he doesn't really need to
Right.
just because, they have some other guys that are spacing the floor. And then Asor Thompson being, already like a terrific rebounder
Yeah.
through the first few
Helps.
games, right? Where he's got, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, a steal in the block, doing a lot of the little things like we mentioned that we liked in terms of what we saw out of him, when he was in the draft. We were very high on him. So,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to like about this Detroit team. Not so much for the Bulls, but I think with Detroit, there's a lot to like.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's kind of interesting looking at, the dichotomy between the two teams because Chicago, they constructed this team with the hopes of being a good team and going to the playoffs. I know the Lonzo injury doesn't help, but at this point, I'm screaming free Zach LaVine. I know, a lot of times he goes off and then they don't normally win the game. So, that's kind of a common reoccurrence throughout his career. Um, but in general, I think Chicago just needs to blow this thing up if possible. I doubt they're going to do that, though. It seems like they're clinging onto this team with dear life. So I don't know. It's just a weird situation for Chicago. But in terms of Detroit, I do like everything that they've got going on. I think they're one of the more potential heavy teams in the East. I think probably in the next couple of years we'll be looking at them how we looked at Orlando this season so far. So
Right.
they have some talent coming off the bench even. But that starting five is young. They're all very young, and I think they all have extreme potential upside. Not to be stars, but I think, to be very efficient players that can take a team and this Detroit Pistons franchise to the playoffs, which they haven't been in a long time.
Yeah, I agree. Because again, there's a lot to like in terms of the talent, right? You got Cade, you have Duran, you have a Sore, so you already have like a solid crop of young guys. And then there's some other guys, right? Like say, Ivy's now a six man coming off the
Right.
bench, which is fine for now. You got Bagley who's kind of sort of revitalizing himself, as a decent backup big for the Pistons. Isaiah Stewart, we'll see what happens with Killian Hayes, but regardless, again, there's a lot here. And like you said, down the line, this I think could be like, a very good team. Because again, you already have Cade who could be like, a future, all-star, all NBA type guy
Yeah,
down the line. Combined with some other really intriguing pieces as well.
absolutely.
Yeah, and then you know, I guess moving on, Rocket Spurs, right? This was another matchup where it was between two young teams, that are in kind of slightly different spots, but will ultimately probably end up in a similar, spot
Hmm.
where, the Rockets, kind of like what you mentioned with the Bulls, where the Rockets, I think, constructed their team to be a more competitive, team with their eyes on, a play-in playoff spot, whereas the Spurs are going through a complete and total rebuild. Um, but the Spurs ended up getting the best of the Rockets in this game, right? And Victor Wembanyama, right down the stretch, right? He had 21 points, 12 rebounds, 3 blocks, 3 steals. Hit the shot to put it into overtime, and then they ended up pulling out of it. In the win. A lot of good performances from the Spurs, right?
Hmm.
Devin Vassell, 25 points. That's a guy that we talked about that we were very high on. Keldon Johnson with a solid game. 20 points, four rebounds, 4 assists. Um, Zach Collins struggled a little bit, but again, his role is the big next to Wenbanyama, so that's fine.
Yeah.
Jetty Osman coming off the bench. Trey Jones running the second unit, which and also closing with these guys. I thought he had a pretty solid performance.
Hmm.
Um, we continue to see Point Sohan, which again I think both you and I think is kind of a strange
Hmm.
thing because I think he's got some passing skills, but I don't necessarily think he can really run the point guard
Right.
spot. Again, Spurs are experimenting with a lot of stuff, but I feel
Hmm.
like down the line that's probably not the ideal
Right.
grouping. But still, for now, again, it's fine, I guess, in the sense of you do have a guy in Jones who you can have run with the second unit and also close. But regardless, we already talked about the Spurs before, but still, let's kind of go into it in terms of what we saw and
Yeah.
what we liked.
I mean, like, for me, the problem that I have with the Spurs is just the usage of Wemby. I'm not a fan of the high volume threes. I said that a long time ago, and you agreed as well. We want to see him banging down low posts, but
Right.
they're not playing him traditionally, which is okay, I guess. But the high volume of threes, 0 for 6. Not a fan of that, obviously. We know he can hit it, but I don't think he should be taking 6. I think he should be probably taking three threes per game. But that might just be me. Um,
Yeah.
like you said, overall weird vibes of the whole Point Sohan thing. I'd prefer to just run Trey Jones, but their goal is not to win games. They are trying to lose games. I'm going to assume to get a higher pick and be in the
But they
lottery.
did win.
Yeah, but they did win. And that's the thing. They have to strike the balance, and I think they're learning that that's going to be a problem. You don't want to discourage your young superstar, your young, number one pick. So, if the guy is losing every game, he's not going to be very happy his rookie year. So I think, you should get him some solid wins. And I think they did that in this one, albeit it is against the Rockets, who didn't have that great of a game. There were some standouts, but there were also some stinkers there. And
Right.
Jabari
Yeah.
Smith Jr. hasn't looked that great. Hopefully he does look better because I think he was one of the standouts in the summer league in the preseason. But to go back to San Antonio, um, it's just weird usage. That's really all I have to say about Wemby. I think he'll be good, but I think they have to figure out how to use him more efficiently because I think it can be
And I
done.
thought he had a good game. I thought he had a terrific game, especially down the
Yeah,
stretch. It's just like you said, ideally, you probably don't want him shooting as many threes. I mean,
right.
you look at their, starting bigs, right? They win a combined 0 of 13 from three, and that happens
Yeah.
sometimes where you just can't knock down a shot.
Hmm.
But those guys aren't necessarily elite 3-point shooters either. So,
Right.
um, but again, like you said, they're not necessarily trying to win games. Not the players, but the organization is
Right.
not, going into this season with the goal of making the playoffs.
Right.
They're trying to see what they have in terms of these young guys and continue to rebuild. Whereas
Hmm.
the Rockets are the team that's trying to win games, but so far they haven't.
Yeah, which is
And like you
interesting.
said, some of that ties it. Yeah, and some of that ties into some of the guys that they've had high expectations for just haven't played as well.
Hmm.
Like a Jabari Smith Jr. That's a guy where, like you mentioned, and like we saw, he was really good in summer league and he was really good in preseason. But so far through the first couple of games, the shot hasn't fallen.
Right.
That's the main thing. If that starts to fall, right, then obviously it'll look different. But for now, again, sometimes guys go through cold stretches, and 5 for 16 is definitely cold stretch.
Yeah.
And there were other guys, but just in general, like you know, he's kind of the key to if the Rockets are going to be better than what we think. That's probably the guy that would need to take another
Yeah.
step forward.
Yeah.
Um, And then moving on into another thing, so the as that was another team that we didn't necessarily talk about. So they had a couple of games, right? The first, they had one, the other night, right, where they got blown out by the Suns, without Booker and Beal. And then in the game before that, right, they did, pull out a win against the Clippers, right, where you had a weird situation where I think Westbrook was kind of forced into, taking a shot at the end of the game, and you saw
Hmm.
Kawhi's reaction. 'Cause there were a lot of discussions about this because some people felt like, well, there's enough time in the game where Westbrook could have passed, to a guy, and then other guys, and then other people are thinking like, well, there's such little time on the clock,
Hmm.
that you kind of already have to kind of scramble for the ball and then kind of do something with it. So I don't really put too much blame, on Westbrook for that. He did have a rough game, in fairness. Um, where he had, I think 5 turnovers, 4 points, 9 rebounds, but still not
Yeah.
really a great game from him at 37 minutes. But still, I think the more negative aspect is it just didn't look, great to me, to see Kawhi kind of have, just such a strange reaction at the end of the game. And, as you mentioned before we, went on to record, he didn't have a great, stretch to close the game
Yeah.
either. So,
Yeah. And like my thing is like everybody shares blame. He held the ball, for what felt like an eternity before even, doing whatever he did. I can't even remember the sequence. But I don't blame that shot on Russ. I think, in that situation, all these guys are NBA players. They all have the ability to make, that shot. And I think that's a shot that most NBA players have made in their lifetime. So I don't really have a problem with him taking it. And he's not, the worst mid range shooter. I think it was a mid range, like fade away off of 1 foot, if I remember correctly. So I don't really have that big of a problem. You just got to close games better. And that's all I can really say. I know Kawhi and PG had, pretty good games, but I would say Paul George should be the closer on this team. I think we know that he can do that. Kawhi, I think, can do that as well, but Kawhi has a tendency to hold the ball a little bit too long and may take a worse shot than Paul George. So I'd like to see them go to Paul George in late moments, but Westbrook is a fine option as well. I don't really have too much of a problem with it. It's just one game.
yeah. Um, and then kind of looking more so towards the Jazz, right?
Hmm.
In the next game they got blown out. I think, seeing the Jazz, I think something that I talked about, in the off season, where I thought that like they may have upgraded their talent maybe at the guard spot, but I feel like in terms of how they actually play, I felt like it was a downgrade.
Hmm.
Because I know that was something that we kind of disagreed on a little bit in the off season with the Jazz, but I think you can
Sure.
kind of see, you know, compared to when you had say Mike Conley, running the point, who may not necessarily be as talented as say like a Colin Sexton at this point in their
Hmm.
careers. But when you see him kind of like running the team, especially down the stretch, compared to like now they have THT, Taylor Horton Tucker running
Right.
the point guards. and it just doesn't work as well. Just because that's one that's not really what he is. He's not really a point guard.
Right.
But just in general, I think that's kind of the issue that the Jazz are going to be facing this season, where now you don't really have too many guards who are good at setting other guys up, and I think that's going to kind of hurt some of the other guys on the roster as well, right? Like say like a Walker Kessler, who's kind of a limited offensive player for the most part. He kind of needs somebody to help set things up for him. Markkinen can get his own, so probably won't really feel too much of a difference, but there are other guys on the roster that I think kind of rely on some of those playmakers, and the Jazz just don't really have that. And I think that's the scenario where they got some more talent, but they're probably just not going to be able to win as many games this season just because, you lost, some things here and there, over the course of, the off season.
Yeah. They're in an interesting spot. I think they do, like you said, they have some guard talent. And
Mm,
they have a decent amount of names that, everybody's familiar with, like Jordan Clarkson, Horton Tucker, Chris Dunn, and now Keontae George, who's a rookie. But, I don't know. It is kind of interesting what they'll do, and I think they'll figure it out. I think it's just going to take time. But I think, Sexton can potentially do it, but it is kind of interesting. I think he came off the bench in this game. So I'm not really sure what the thought process is with Horton Tucker. I'm not, a Horton Tucker guy. I don't think that, he's a sustainable point guard or two guard, to be honest. I think he should be coming off the bench for sure.
right.
I would
Yeah.
prefer
I don't
them
think he's
to,
a starter.
yeah, and I prefer them to, run Jordan Clarkson and Colin Sexton. But I do understand that this size is an issue in the NBA, so I know that they would get overwhelmed defensively. But I think they should give Colin Sexton a shot because, I think he had around 6 assists. Yeah, so he didn't play, horrible. Just I'm not really sure why he came off the bench.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's going to be, like you said, something that the Jazz are going to have to figure out.
Yeah.
Is what do we do with our guards? Because we have a number of them who are fine, right? Who are solid players, but which guys fit the best, and which guys can kind of help make it easier for everyone else, and that's probably going to be the struggle because their guards don't necessarily make other guys better. Those
Right.
guys are kind of like score first guards,
Yeah.
which is fine. But they are like real score
Hmm.
first guys where they
And
don't look
Markkinen's
to
balling out too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So shout out to Markkinen as well because,
Yeah.
keeping his play up from last season where, again, I didn't expect to drop off at all because he had a
Right. Right.
really
Right.
good year and I think he's gotten better, in different skills, right? Like with the ball, getting to the basket, playing downhill, while still being able to score off the dribble and shoot. So
Yeah.
those are good tricks to have, as an offensive player.
Hmm.
And, he's got a lot of size. So I
Yeah.
think it makes sense.
Especially at his height. Yeah.
And then yeah, and then moving on, Oklahoma City, right? They got a win over the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cavs were a little bit shorthanded, right? No
Hmm.
Darius Garland, no Jared Allen. But again, you saw with Oklahoma City the reason why there's a lot of people who are really high on them going into this season, right? Obviously, Shea Gilgeous-Alexander leading the way with 34 points, 11 rebounds, 4 assists, 5 steals, and a block, right? Looking like, a potential early MVP candidate. And then
It's
also
crazy.
Chet Holmgren, right? With the game, a bounce back defensive performance, especially, where we talked about him, in the previous episode where, the defense, he had a couple of moments that were kind of fun, but he is a rookie. But in this
Yeah.
game, you really saw the impact he made,
Absolutely.
defensively with the 13 rebounds, but also the 7 blocks, including, I think, 5 in the first half,
Hmm.
right? Again, that's the value of having a guy like that if you're Oklahoma City, where now you have a legit 7 footer, who can, contest shots and rebound and, block shots as well and, just impact a lot of things defensively.
And he
And that's
claims
part
he
of
had
what we'll be.
more too, which is the funny part.
Yeah, exactly. He ended up with 7. So,
Hmm.
I mean, that's a huge thing to have now with Oklahoma City, where now you have more size and skill on the roster. And, again, this is a situation where I think regular season wise, people, we might have to change our outlook in terms of, how many games they might win in the regular season. Cause I think we both thought they would be better, but still probably be like closer to that, 7, to 10 spot in the play in, maybe like 7, 8.
Yeah.
But they could potentially, be in a situation where maybe they don't make it out of the first round, but they could finish as like a top 5 seed.
Yeah.
But we'll see because again, it is early, and guys still have to stay healthy. But
Yeah.
for now, I think there's a lot to like in terms of what we saw and what we've seen from Oklahoma City thus far. Josh Giddey didn't necessarily play great, but Now he doesn't have to be as great every game because now you have other guys,
Right.
who can help you out, right? You got a Cason Wallace, you got, Chet Holmgren now, so you have other people that can help. And Lou Dort ended up having, a better offensive performance.
Hmm.
So, they just have more guys I think to turn to now, which
Yeah.
especially in terms of size, that helps.
Yeah, their starting five, they can all cook, to be honest. And the thing with Josh Giddey is like you don't need, like you said, you don't really need him to score. You just need him to be there to set guys up and get rebounds and play defense. Honestly, same with Dort as well, because I think the three guys, Shea, Jalen Williams, and Chet Holmgren. I think those are phenomenal scorers. I think they all can score at all three levels at an efficient rate. And that's what we've seen so far from them, through two games. And I think the hype is real behind this team now. I know it's, been two games and we don't want to bandwagon, but they look like the truth. And that's a good thing to see from a young team like this. And shout out to Shea. He's been hooping, like you said, potential and early MVP candidate right now.
Yeah, and again, kind of going back to Cleveland for a little bit.
Hmm.
Again, a little bit shorthanded. So
Yeah.
they were fine in the first game. Donovan Mitchell had a huge game with 43.
Hmm.
Mobley had 14 and 15, which you'd like to see a little bit more, just
Yeah.
because again, it's also without Garland. I think that's the next guy, in that starting group, that you probably would like to see a little bit more offensively out of.
Hmm.
He had a better game before that, but just in general, that's just something to think about.
Yeah.
Where again I'm not saying he's on the clock or anything, but
Right.
just, again, in year three, you'd like to see a little bit more of an offensive uptick for him because we know he can defend. But, hey, again, Chet Holmgren, it was a tough, matchup because, again, like Holmgren is, size wise kind of similar to Mobley,
Hmm.
where they're both, tall, very slight guys, but they both move very well. So, I
Yeah.
mean, again, with Holmgren matching up against like a real NBA big, like a legitimate NBA big, that's, I think he answered the bell with that one. So,
Yeah, huge bounce back for him, and that was my candidate for defensive player of the year. So it seems like it may work out because the last game was not pretty defensively for him.
right. And and that's the thing, where like just in general, as a young guy, it's kind of hard to come in, and be a really good defensive player, in your first year.
Yeah.
But, he's got a chance, I think, I don't necessarily think he'll win it, but I think he definitely has the chance to be, defensively great right out of the gates just
Yeah.
because again, he's got length, he's got timing, he's got, like seems like a pretty solid defensive IQ in
Yeah.
terms of where to be positioned and how to use his length effectively. And not just foul like every other possession, because that's sometimes something that you might see with some guys who block a lot of shots where they just end up fouling a lot because they're really aggressive in terms of like I have to go for the block.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
to see that from a guy who again is basically in his rookie year, that's pretty impressive. Again, he did have
Extremely.
a whole year to kind of train and figure stuff out, but still,
Yeah.
your rookie season is your rookie season
Yeah.
regardless. So
Yeah. This is his first NBA action, and through two games, I think he's looked great.
yeah. And then moving on into another potential MVP candidate, right? You look at Dallas, who started off the season, winning the first two games, albeit against, not great competition, but wins are wins. And these are the types of games that Dallas would have lost last year because we talked about it last year, right? Where they would have games where, Luka and Kyrie would play, but then they would still lose to a team like a Charlotte, a shorthanded Charlotte team. But you look at the stat line, right? Luka Doncic with 49, 10 and 7, with some crazy shots down the stretch.
Hmm.
Kyrie for the first couple of games offensively hasn't been quite as good. But Luka's more than made up for that. Lively, this was kind of the interesting thing where now he was moved into the starting lineup. Not as crazy of a stat line as in the first game, right? Where he only had, in this game he only had 9 points, 2 rebounds, but still a positive, impact over the course of the game.
Hmm.
Grant Williams, right, offensively not as good. But you had a couple of guys off the bench, right? Tim Hardaway Jr., right? 6 of 17, but still 19 points, helped them, over the course of the game. Dwight Powell as the backup big, right? 11 points, 2 rebounds, but still a -6 in the stat line.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the issue, with the Dallas team is there's still some guys that I think they're going to have to figure out, who are our best options, right? You know what I mean? Like Josh Green, he played 28 minutes off the bench. It seems like he's just going to be, a guy who doesn't start but does close for them a lot, which I guess is okay. But I'm still not a huge fan of, the Derek Jones Jr. thing in the starting five. But
Me neither.
and I guess, if he's not going to play as much, it's not that big of a deal. But
Right.
um, overall, what have you thought about Dallas in the first couple of games? Because again, like I said, it has been against a couple of weak-ish teams. Claxton didn't play, but
Hmm.
still, you still have to be at least a little bit, you know, feel a little bit better about what we've seen from Dallas. Now that
Yeah.
again, you got a real center and Lively, but I think there's still probably a team that's going to have to do a little bit more by the deadline, probably to be like a serious team.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. This game to me really came down to free throws. I know Luka's amazing and all that stuff, but it really came down to free throws because if you look at Brooklyn's stats, 48% from the field and then also 48 from three, and then you look at
Crazy
Dallas,
3 point.
yeah, and then you look at Dallas, it's more so 48 from the field and then 41 um from three and then 78% from the free throw line, but it was on 28 attempts versus, Brooklyn's 10 attempts. So I see where the game was won, but shout out to Luka for that crazy shot, like you said. But for Dallas, I don't understand the Derrick Jones Jr. starting thing. I'm guessing it's due to effort, maybe size or something like
Yeah.
that. But I'd still prefer to have more of a guy that can actually not per se do something with the ball, but shoot and stretch the floor because I think that's something that you want to have, especially if you're if you're starting Derek Lively and Derek Jones. I don't think that's a great combo. That's two guys that cannot really shoot. Derek Lively doesn't shoot at all, and then Jones Jr. just doesn't have a high percentage. 3 point percentage career wise, but I think they should look to start maybe, like you said, Green or even, Hardaway. I know Hardaway is more their like 6 man guy and he comes off the bench with high volume numbers, but it is what it is. But overall, I've been impressed with Dallas, through the 2 games that they've played. And I think, this is a team that let me down badly last year. But I do have better hopes for them because I think they did get substantially better, in picking Lively, and then Grant Williams has been pretty good as well. So not too
Yeah,
many
I think
complaints from me from them.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to I think some of those guys they just would prefer them closing the game
Hmm.
so that way if they come off the bench then they can still play high minutes
Right.
but like not end up playing like 40 minutes,
Hmm.
because that's
Yeah,
the thing
I get it.
that we saw with Lively where he played like 34 minutes in his first game, but a lot of that was because he started and played pretty much the whole second half. But this
Hmm.
time he started and didn't play quite as many minutes, played 17.
Right.
So, and I guess that's kind of, so that way, like, again, he can't play the whole game. We have to have another big. But that's the problem is when you have somebody who isn't lively, on the floor, that's a big, it's kind of a struggle.
Yeah.
Max Kleba, even though he didn't score, he was a positive just because he can space the floor, and still do some things. But again, I think, like I said, the big rotation and the wing rotation is where I think Dallas needs to look to make some upgrades. And again,
Yeah.
I think some of that starts by at some point they're going to have to probably decide which guards they kind of want to stick with and which ones they want to move on from because that's kind of where the issue is because there's a lot of guards and like you have a guy like Jaden Hardy who's not playing right now and I don't feel like he's probably going to be a real part of the rotation because some of the things that he can do they already have guys that can do that so they don't really need him.
Right.
um, so and it's like he's kind of a guy where he kind of needs the ball in order to score, but how much is that going to happen? With the guys that they have in Luka and Kyrie. So that's
Right.
kind of a scenario I'm thinking like, yeah, by the trade deadline, we'll see where they are. If they're like, a top 5 team in the Western Conference, right, then they'll probably look to make a move. But whereas if they're like, 500 or below, then we'll see what happens. But
Yeah.
again, it's an early MVP candidate, and I think for Dallas, Luka was looked at as one of the odds-on favorites to win it. And if Dallas can get like a top 4 seed, 5 seed, if they can get close to like 50 wins, then he'll probably get it. Because
Yeah.
uh, when
With
you
his
look at his
numbers,
team,
yeah.
yeah, it's the numbers, and then in the combination of like, well, after Kyrie, who's their third best player, and it's kind of whoever it is, whoever you think it is worse than a lot of other teams' third best players, right? Like say like a Aaron Gordon would be Denver's third best player, and he would be significantly better than anybody on Dallas outside of Luka and Kyrie. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
And then you go down the line for the other teams, right? Like Bradley Beal, for the Suns or whoever you think it is for Golden State. It's just it's a similar thing, and I think that's his path to win MVP. If they can get close to 50 wins and he puts up crazy numbers, which he will, and he'll have to do that if they're going to win close to 50 games. That's where he could get it. So
Yeah, of course.
it'll be interesting for sure because there's a lot of guys that I think that are candidates, including again like a Shea Gilgeous-Alexander that we already talked about, and some other guys that are kind of mainstays that if their teams do well, then they'll have a chance. Like Jokic could have a chance to win MVP.
Yeah.
If Denver continues to win a bunch of games. So
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, after that, I mean, for the most part, again, like that, this is pretty much, it in terms of the opening weekend, for the NBA. We still have, more games to go. We're recording this on Sunday, so we're gonna have some games. Like for example, I'm already in Los Angeles, and I'm gonna see the Clippers and the Spurs play. And we still have some other games down the stretch as well. I believe the Lakers play the Kings. So that'll be also another interesting West Coast matchup between two, teams that are going to be playoff teams or competing for the
Yeah.
playoffs in the Western Conference. And then from again the Clippers Spurs perspective, right? You got a team that's rebuilding that has like a potentially generational guy, against the team in the Clippers who's also looking to pile up some wins. Um, and then in terms of the news rumors going around, really not anything else. For the most part, we did have potential a signing I guess occur, and that was Bismack Biyombo. It seems like he's gonna be going to Memphis, to help out their situation.
They
Because we
suck.
hadn't talked, we hadn't talked about it yet, but they are 0-3. I believe, yeah, exactly, because they're 0-3, right? They lost to can't remember who they lost to in the first game, but I remember they lost to Denver a couple nights ago, and they lost to Washington, the Wizards,
Yeah.
in the Wizards home opener.
Yeah.
So that's a rough situation, and I
I
think
was there. That was bad.
right, yeah, and I think with Biombo again, is it really gonna be the thing that saves Memphis for now? Probably not, but their big situation is really rough because again, we already know they're or not even just their bigs, but right there without their best player in Ja, he's
Hmm.
not going to be back for 20 plus more games.
Yep.
Steven Adams is out for the year, so that's your starting center. Brandon Clark, who's your backup center, right? He won't be back for quite a while because he tore his Achilles late last year. So they really don't have any great options at bigs other than Jaren Jackson Jr., who's more of a four. He's just not really a center. Even though he's got the size, to play center, he doesn't really rebound that great.
Yep.
Um, he needs another, he needs a more traditional five next to him, and I guess Biombo might be that. I believe they have to wait a couple of games. I think they have to wait until Ja gets to his fifth game, out before they can sign him. So it'll probably take a couple of days or whatever. But again, this was kind of funny because he was a guy that we talked about a little bit in the offseason, in regards to some other teams that might need a backup center. I
Yeah.
don't know if he'll start. Maybe he will start.
True.
But yeah, it's a rough situation in Memphis for sure, just because we hadn't talked about it, but yeah, they are 0-3, and I
Yeah.
think we said before the season started it was going to be rough because without Ja and without Steven Adams and Brandon Clark, you lost your best player and you lost some depth at that big man spot, so you're small. And you're relying on, again, some guys like, Marcus Smart, who hasn't been bad. But again, he's not going to be able to kind of single handedly, help Memphis win games. So it's kind of basically like Jaren Jackson Jr. and Desmond Bain. They have to be basically all-star, all NBA players pretty much every night. Even
Yeah.
like a guy like a Derrick Rose who hadn't really been in a real NBA rotation in a couple seasons, he's ended up having to play. And it's just not working. So, we'll see if the Biombo thing works, but it's been a rough start for Memphis so far. Again, 0-3 to start the year, and again, it's not the easiest schedule. So I mean,
Yeah.
they're gonna have to find a way, to kind of hang around until Ja comes back, or else they're gonna be, in a spot where midway through the season they're gonna be, having to really claw their way back up.
Yeah. I think they're going to be in a hole that might be one that's too hard to climb out of, even with a talent like John Morant. Because then you still have to factor in you're probably going to still lose some games with Ja as well. So you got to try and squeeze some wins out of this situation. But 0-3 is not a good start, especially, since you're going up against, teams like Washington where they're in a full rebuild. You shouldn't be losing those games. But I do understand they're completely crippled at this point.
Yeah, because again, that game, it ended up getting close, but it was like a blowout, at one point where I think
Yeah.
the Wizards were up by like 20. I know
Yes, we
the
were.
Grizzlies kind of got back into the game, but
Hmm.
it never really felt like you were threatened to lose the game.
Yeah.
Just you know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Yeah. Like, and that's how I felt, when I was there. Like, I was on my phone, when it was a 20-point game because I was like, there's nothing really happening. And then all of a sudden, Memphis cuts it. But then I'm like, no worries, we'll just hit all the free throws. And all we need is a three to, sustain the lead. And that's what they did. Just kept making threes.
yeah, yeah, and I guess kind of to wrap it up, I guess with your Wizards, they got their first win of the season only two
Yeah.
games in. In the first game, right, it was pretty rough, where they gave up 143.
Hmm.
Whereas in this game it was 106. Again, different type of team, not
Yeah.
necessarily inclined to score as much. But yeah, how was the environment, in that Wizards,
Yeah.
arena? Because again, now they're in a situation where the fans know, now they're going through a rebuild.
Yeah, it's funny because Capital One, that was probably the most live I'd seen it, and like, um I don't know. The environment just felt natural. There was a lot of hype. I was actually talking to one guy who ended up becoming one of our subscribers. He kind of agreed with us that we're gonna go over 30 wins. Well, me, he thinks that we're gonna go over 30 wins. I know you think we're gonna go over 26. I think. Um, so the environment was pretty good though. It was loud. People were in the game. I didn't really see a lot of Memphis fans, so it seemed like it was all Wizards fans. Jordan Poole addressed the fans. I thought that was pretty good. And shout out to everybody who balled out. I think Kuzma and Jordan Poole, they played good games, not super efficient, but they were they still got the job done. And then obviously Corey Kispert played, a great game, and then Daniel Gafford as well. So, I think the team looked good in this game, albeit it was against, the Grizzlies without Ja Morant, but it is what it is. And I think, there's a sense of excitement for the Wizards, and that's a good thing because you always want to have, the fans behind you when you're in a full on rebuild like this.
Yeah, I think the over under was like 24,
Okay.
I think it was like either 23 or 24, and I think I thought that they would go a little over that.
Yeah.
Again, it's not that they're like a great team, but I feel like there's potential for them to get to like 24,
Right.
25 wins. Again, it just I think some of that will depend on how healthy guys are, and do they have a potential situation towards the end of the season where they just start sitting guys, but now you're not supposed to be able to do that, but it seems like teams are still doing it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, we're, continuing to go through the opening week of the NBA. It's been a really good one. I think there's a lot of excitement around the league. You mentioned it with the Wizards, which are a rebuilding team. And of course, there's, I think, a lot of excitement, alongside teams that are contenders as well, because I think there's a lot of teams that feel like they have a real shot at doing something. So, we're going to continue to talk about it. So let us know in the comments what you think, of all the things going on so far the opening week in the NBA. I mean, again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. To help grow the channel. As we trying to get to 50 subs. Over the course of the year. So we appreciate all the support, and we'll see you next week.